Hello, good evening, and welcome, just like yesterday. Hello, and welcome to another reading from the Falconer's Quarry, the third book in the Skygatherer series. We've got to chapter 6 now, so I hope you're keeping up. I can see quite a lot of you sort of following along a week or two behind me, catching up with the videos, watching to catch up, and a lot of you into the Saving the Unicorn's Horn at the moment, which is the Vikings story. So if you've come into this series at this book, then there are others. The first one is Roman, and that's all available on Facebook and on YouTube. Wherever you've just found this, you'll find that. The Leopard in the Golden Cage, and then there's a Viking story as well, Saving the Unicorn's Horn, which we had previously. So today we've got the meal that Joe is staying for at Old Wardour Castle, and I was just having a quick flick through to see what was coming up, because of course yesterday we ended up having Lose, which I had forgotten was coming up, because there's always Lose in all these books. Today we've got this meal, and there's a lot of fish, as I think I mentioned yesterday. I counted 6 or 7 types. Lampreys come up twice. I don't think I've ever seen a lamprey, but anyway, that comes up twice. I think they're a bit like an eel, a lamprey. And there's a lot of Latin in here. Now, I don't speak Latin. So if you speak Latin and I've pronounced it wrong, you're going to have to forgive me. So I will do my best to pronounce it as I believe it's pronounced. I do speak French, and I used to speak a bit of Spanish. And I learnt to read some bits of Latin at university in connection with French and Spanish, but yeah, I don't know how the Romans pronounce things, or even indeed the Tudors when they were speaking Latin. So here we are. Fine. Okay, chapter 6. Oh yes, Joe's been just shown into the Great Chamber, I think it's called, which is where Lucy's family is eating. The rest of the company, all the servants, are sitting in the Great Hall, except for all the outdoor servants who are being fed in the boiling house, or from the boiling house outside. The indoor servants are fed in the Great Hall, and the family is going to be eating in the Great Chamber. It's still there, the Great Chamber at Old Wardour Castle. If you ever go there, you'll find the Great Hall has no roof anymore, because that was destroyed. The whole place at Old Wardour Castle was largely destroyed in the Civil War in the 1600s. But you'll see the Great Hall, and then just off it there is this chamber, which, if you were approaching the castle from the ticket office, it's pretty much what appears to be the front, and it's got the front wall blown off, and that's the Great Chamber. It's not very big, actually, not massively great, although I suppose I'm judging it by the size of castles and things. Compared to most of our houses, it's pretty huge. Anyway. Okay, chapter 6. Oh, he's just been... Another aside. He's just been introduced. Joe has just been introduced to Lucy's aunt, Lady Jane. Okay. Joe took off his cap and bowed. He waited until Lucy's aunt was seated, and the 2 men and the much older lady who had followed her into the room, then put his cap back on and sat down beside Lucy. A second manservant entered and approached Lady Jane. "Morley will take his meal while he works, my lady. He says there is much to do before tomorrow, and begs you to excuse him." "Very well," she replied. "Let them bring the food at once, then." The man bowed and left the room. In the doorway he passed the servant boy, who crossed the room towards Joe. The boy avoided Joe's eye and set a wooden board, a spoon, a tankard, and a napkin on the tablecloth in front of him. Beside the spoon he put down a small white loaf of bread. Joe saw that everyone else had a loaf already. It seemed like a lot of bread to eat at one meal, but if they were fasting for Lent, perhaps there wouldn't be much else. Lucy was explaining to her aunt and the old lady how Joe had rescued her in the woods. Joe only half listened. The servant boy had gone to stand behind him, beside the chief manservant. Joe wished he could see him. It worried him that the boy had been so fascinated by the St. Christopher. Of course, he thought, he still had to find a moment to give it to Lucy. It would be better to do it soon, since there was no knowing when he would be pulled back into his own time. There was a sudden silence around the table. Joe realised that Lucy's aunt had asked him a question. "Please forgive me, my lady," he said. "I was lost in thought." Lady Jane smiled. "Thinking is a good habit, as long as it doesn't turn to daydreaming. I asked how you came to be employed by Sir William Paulet." Joe panicked. How did these things work? "The steward is a friend of my family," he said, praying that that would seem reasonable. Fortunately, before he had to say anything further, the second manservant reappeared with a bowl of water, with herbs and orange peel floating in it for them to wash their hands. 5 boys entered the room behind him, 4 of them bearing large platters, and 1 carrying a cauldron. 3 of the platter bearers were dressed identically in what Joe supposed was the livery of the household, so these must be pages, like himself. The manservant in charge stood beside Lady Jane. "Today we have salad, my lady, though alas without the boiled eggs. There is also pottage of lampreys, white herring with mustard sauce, minced salt salmon, and trout upon sops." As he named each dish, the boy holding it stepped forward and presented it to Lady Jane. Each one was large enough to be a meal on its own for all of them. So much for fasting, Joe thought. The boy carrying the pottage began serving Lucy's aunt and then the other guests, while the other dishes were carried over to a sideboard that seemed to be covered with a carpet. Joe wondered if he was mistaken, but it occurred to him that he hadn't seen any carpets on the floors here so far. Perhaps they didn't like to walk on them. The pages came and sat down at the table beside Joe, while the 2 men servants set to work filleting the herring and trout and serving the food out onto plates. The other servant boy had gone. Joe felt relieved. "Shall we say grace?" Lady Jane nodded to a man dressed from head to toe in black who had appeared at the end of the table. "Benedicite," he pronounced. "Dominus," replied everyone. "Edent pauperus," the priest continued, "et saturam buntur, et laudabunt Dominum qui requirunt eum, vivent corda eorum in saeculum saeculi." The grace went on and on. Joe let the words wash over him, grateful that they weren't expected to join in. "Et ne nos inducas in tentationem," intoned the priest. "Sed libero nos a malo," everyone replied. Joe felt a stab of anxiety. Were they going to be required to say something now? Perhaps they were going to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin, or something like that. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on his lap. "Oremus," declared the priest. "Benedic Domine nos et dona tua quae de tua largitate summus sumpturi, per Christum Dominum nostrum." "Amen," said everyone. Joe looked up, but the priest still hadn't finished. "Iube Domine benedicere," he began again. Joe looked quickly down again. Whenever was he going to get to the end? At this rate, the food would be completely cold. "Ubi Christus est in dextera Dei sedens." "Amen," said everyone again. This time Joe waited and watched out of the corner of his eye before raising his head. But everyone relaxed and began to talk again. The priest vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. Lady Jane turned to address Joe. "Eat as much as you wish," she said, as one of the serving men placed a plate between Joe and Lucy with a substantial portion of each of the different types of food on it. "I'm sorry there isn't more," Lucy's aunt said. And of course there's no meat. Lent can seem long, can it not? One of the men sitting with them said, I know of a household where they eat beaver during Lent. But that's not a fish, protested Lucy. It is, or at least its tail is, being in the water all the time. And who's to know if a bit of the animal slips into the pot with it? Is it true that you can eat duck too, if it's swimming when you kill it? Asked one of the pages. Surely not, Lady Jane exclaimed. I heard worse last week, said the second man. There was a man near Oxford so desperate for meat that he hauled a cow out of the river it had fallen into and ate that. Everyone laughed. That can't be right, said Lucy's aunt, though I do sympathise. I long for meat again. I hope you'll still be here tomorrow, Master Hopkins. We'll be having at least for each remove, and there will be capons, venison, mutton, lamb, goose, chicken. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment it was quiet around the table as everyone contemplated the prospect. I'd love to stay, Jo said, but it depends on when Sir William's answer is ready for the Lord St. John. And then what, he thought. Then I ride out into a world I don't know, without Lucy. Fear turned over in his stomach. He pushed the thought away and looked to see how the others were eating. The pottage had been served into clay bowls, and one of the pages had begun eating his by dipping his bread into it. 4 more big plates had been put down with a bit of everything on them, so that there was one between 2. Most people were serving food from these onto the wooden boards in front of them, using the spoons that had been set at each place. There were no knives or forks on the table, but each person seemed to be using their own knife to cut up the food. He took out his knife from his purse. They only ever picked up the food with their right hands, he noticed, wiping their fingers afterwards on the napkins spread over their left shoulders. Cautiously he began to copy Lucy, hoping he didn't break some other rule he hadn't spotted. The salad was fine, and the bread was all right, though heavier than he was used to. But the pottage of lampreys had some horrible grey eel things in it, which didn't want to stay down when he swallowed them. While he was trying not to gag, the chief manservant leaned past him with a jug and filled up his tankard with water. Jo took a sip. It tasted more or less the same as water at home. Gratefully he gulped it down. Lucy's aunt was looking at him with amusement. The water is refreshing here, isn't it? Do you not have sweet water at Nunney? Jo hesitated. Surely there's a spring somewhere on the estate, or I'd have thought William Paulet would have built conduits to bring fresh water to his castle. Jo made himself smile. We do have fresh water, madam. As an afterthought he added, but it's not as delicious as this. Lady Jane beamed. When everyone had eaten as much as they wanted, the plates and platters were cleared away, still half full, and the cloth was stripped from the table. Beneath it, a carpet covered the tabletop, exactly like the one over the sideboard. At once the 2 men-servants spread a fresh white cloth on it, and the servant boys brought clean boards and spoons. The pages stood up and left the room with the other servants. Jo wondered what was going to happen next. There couldn't be more food. A few minutes later the manservant returned with a fresh bowl of water for washing, followed by the 5 boys bearing more platters. For the second remove, my lady, announced the chief manservant, we have bream in a vinegar sauce, carp upon sops, roast lampreys in galantine sauce, miniature sepulchres made with rice and dried fruit, and blanched almonds. Once more the men-servants divided the food onto 5 plates and brought them to the table. Jo was aghast. To be polite, he took some bream, because he knew already that he couldn't eat the roast lampreys. He wasn't sure about the sops that went with the carp either. It seemed to be bread soaked in a fishy sauce. He could really understand how fed up with fish you would get, day after day, especially since apart from the salad there hadn't been any vegetables to go with it. They were just coming to the end of the odd little rice constructions when Joe became aware of muttering behind him. "The steward has sent for you, Master Hopkins," the manservant said. "Sir William has returned earlier than expected." At once one of the servant boys was at his elbow with water to wash his hands. Joe stood up. He could feel a tightness in his chest. "Thank you for your hospitality, my lady," he said, removing his cap once more and bowing to Lucy's aunt. She inclined her head. "At least you've had a good meal before your journey," she said. "Godspeed." "May I go down with him, Aunt?" Lucy said. "Just as far as the stables?" Lady Jane looked surprised. "Of course, if you wish." Lucy got up quickly from her place. Together they went back through the great hall, down the stairs and along the passage to the steward's office. "Here is the communication, Master Hopkins," Morley said briskly. He handed Joe a package exactly like the one he'd delivered. "Please take heed. This is only for the eyes of the Lord St. John. Deliver it in person." Joe nodded and bowed. As he walked with Lucy back along the track to the gatehouse, he felt miserable. "Cheer up," she said. "You're not missing much by going now, rather than tomorrow morning. There isn't another big meal today, and we'll be in chapel all evening." Joe shook his head. She didn't understand. How could she? He'd only had a few hours this time, not even a whole day. Worse, he was leaving to find his way to somewhere else in Tudor England, on his own. He quailed at the thought. "This is it, then," he said, as they came to the stables. Then he clapped his hand to his mouth. "What's the matter?" Lucy asked, alarmed. "I nearly forgot." He stopped and looked around to make sure that there was nobody nearby. Hastily he undid the catch on the chain of his St. Christopher and held it out to her. "You have to take this." Lucy looked at the silver disc hanging from his fingers. "I can't. It must be worth a huge sum. Why would you give it to me?" "You have to take it," he said again. "If you don't, I won't be able to come back here." She looked puzzled. He felt suddenly impatient. Time was running out. "You understand that I came from a different world?" he said, as calmly as he could. "When I've been with you before, I've been pulled back suddenly into my own time. It's something to do with me being in danger. Now I have to ride to Nunney. I have no idea where I'm going or what will happen next." He swallowed. "But it's quite likely that I'll end up back in my own time before I even get there." "I still don't see what the St. Christopher has to do with it." "I'm not exactly sure how it works either, but I think I get called back when you're holding it and thinking of me at the same time as I think of you." "Really?" She wasn't convinced. "Obviously it doesn't happen very often that we think about each other at exactly the same moment," he said, "although I do think about you a lot." He blushed and went on hurriedly. "It's a loan, not a present. One day you can give it back to me." Lucy took the St. Christopher hesitantly. "What if I lose it?" she asked. "You mustn't, and nobody must know you've got it. You should keep it with you all the time, but it has to stay hidden. Here, let me help you put it on." He looked at the scooped neckline of her dress. "No, actually that won't do. Could you attach it to that belt thing you're wearing?" Lucy pulled up a small leather pouch which had been hanging in the folds of her skirt and tipped the St. Christopher into it. "That should be all right," Joe said. "Good. Well then, thank you. I'll try and call you back soon, I promise." On impulse, Joe leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. She looked astonished. He felt himself turn crimson. "Sorry," he said. "I don't know why I did that, except that I've never been able to say goodbye to you before." "That's all right." She smiled shyly. "It was nice to meet you. I'm sorry you can't stay for the feast tomorrow, but I hope we meet again soon." Joe nodded. "Goodbye then, Lucy." He went over to the horse where it stood ready for him, stowed the letter in the saddlebag, and mounted. "God be with you," she waved as he rode away from her towards the main track. When he reached the trees, he waved back. He felt utterly forlorn. For a while he rode uphill into the woodland. The sky had clouded over, and the forest was gloomy. Joe wondered what time it was. Presumably Morley expected him to reach Nunney by nightfall, otherwise he wouldn't have dispatched him. But of course the steward assumed that Joe knew the way. Since he didn't, he might easily still be on the road when darkness came, and then there might be highwaymen or bandits. He urged the animal onwards. Presently he came to a fork in the track. He reined in the horse. Both paths looked equally likely or unlikely. Both were narrow and rutted. Joe wished he'd asked Lucy if she knew the way. She might have been able to give him some pointers, even though she seemed not to have been to Nunney. Suddenly he heard the sound of hoofs. He turned in his saddle. Someone was coming up from the castle. With luck, they might be able to give him directions. As the rider charged into view, however, Joe's heart sank. The boy was no older than him, and either a peasant or a servant, judging by the lack of livery. He wouldn't be able to help. Joe's horse stamped its feet nervously. For a second it seemed as though the boy was going to gallop straight past. But as he saw Joe, he pulled hard on his horse's reins. The animal's hoofs skidded on the track. Joe swallowed. It was the servant boy who had been so fascinated by his St. Christopher. This could not be a coincidence. "Good afternoon," he said pleasantly. The boy ignored Joe's greeting. "I knew you wouldn't have got far," he sneered. "Your sort have the leisure to take their time on errands, not like the rest of us." Joe blinked, taken aback by the boy's ferocity. "I haven't got long." The boy flicked out his knife from a sheath at his waist. It looked a good deal sharper than Joe's. "What do you want?" Joe asked. "As though you didn't know," snarled the boy. "I want the thing I saw round your neck. It's an image of St. Christopher, isn't it? Worth a fair bit, I guess. Not that I'll be selling it." "Why do you want it, then?" The boy's mouth twisted into a joyless smile. "People on their deathbed are going to pay handsomely to get a look at it when they realise that the priest isn't going to get to them in time." "And why would the priest be late?" "Priests are busy men," the boy said sarcastically. "Sometimes they get unavoidably detained." The way he spoke reminded Joe of Thorbjorn. The boy looked a bit like him too. His hair was lighter, but his face was the same shape, and he had the same iron glint in his eyes. Perhaps he'd been wrong, Joe thought suddenly. Perhaps it wasn't Tobias who was the danger in this world. Perhaps it was this boy. "You mean you would stop the priest from visiting the dying? How? You're not big enough to take on a full-grown man." "I've got friends," the boy snapped. "We'll make money enough for us all. Some of us have to make our own way in the world, you know." He thrust out his knife. Joe thought quickly. He couldn't say that he didn't have the St. Christopher, because the boy might guess where it was and go after Lucy. He could try some distraction tactic and then turn the horse round and try to escape, but the boy had plainly ridden much more than Joe had, and he would know the woods better as well. There was just one other option, Joe thought. It was risky, but it might solve all of his problems in one go. Slowly he raised his hand to his collar. He glanced at his face. The boy's eyes were fixed on where he thought the St. Christopher would be. In a sudden movement, Joe brought up his other hand and knocked the knife out of the boy's grasp. The boy shouted out in surprise. If you want it, you'll have to come and get it, Joe taunted. He braced himself. As he expected, the boy lunged at him. Time seemed to slow right down. The boy's nails scratched against his neck, and he felt the weight of the boy's body pushing him backwards. The saddle slipped beneath him. He fought the instinct to hold on. As he fell, he hoped desperately that this would work. For the second time that day, his rib cage slammed into the ground. He groaned. If he'd got this wrong, the boy would be on top of him in a moment, beating him to a pulp. But everything was quiet. He opened his eyes. The boy and both horses had gone. Well, he's just provoked this young man, this boy, into attacking him. And it has done what he expected. I imagine you might know what he's done. I guess it depends whether you've read the other books or listened to the other books before. If you have, you'll know exactly what he's just done. And it worked. Phew. Good. All right, so that's it for today. Chapter 7. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I like what happens next. There are some times when you write something where you come up with an idea just as you're going along that you hadn't thought of before, and it's just sort of slightly pleasing. And I think it's pleasing because you hadn't thought of it. You know, it's come to you out of the blue, and precisely what happens next I kind of like. I mean, it's not massively dramatic or anything, but just pleases me. Anyway, you have to humour me. I've been stuck at home a long time, and of course, because I'm an author, I was stuck at home a long time before you were, because we work alone. We work alone. Have to be alone. Right. For now, it's time to stop. I have to go and show some fish fingers some fire, because that's Tuesday in our house. So I hope you have a nice evening, and I'll see you tomorrow.